December 1943. Somewhere on the outskirts of occupied France, the night lay frozen under a thin crust of snow. Inside a narrow farmhouse attic, 3 British airmen huddled around a dim oil lamp, tracing trembling fingers over the faint red lines of a map printed inside a Monopoly board. It looked like an ordinary game, the kind children played on Christmas evenings back home, yet to these men it was a blueprint for freedom. The smell of wax and dust clung to the air. Outside, a German truck rumbled down the road, its headlights slicing through the shutters for a heartbeat, before vanishing into the dark. None of them spoke. In that silence, they could almost hear the ticking of their own fear, and beneath it, the whisper of possibility. For months, they had hidden in barns and cellars, relying on farmers and strangers who risked everything to feed them. Now, folded inside this innocent board, was something extraordinary: a silk map marked with rivers and rail lines, a tiny compass no bigger than a coin, and a file thin enough to hide between the paper layers. Each piece had been smuggled under the noses of the German guards by an organization so secret that even most Allied officers didn't know it existed. Britain's MI9. One man lifted the board, feeling the faint bulge beneath the cardboard. "If this is real," he whispered, "we might just make it home." Beyond the attic walls, the wind howled across the fields of France. Freedom was somewhere out there, printed between property lines and railway squares, waiting for those brave enough to roll the dice. If stories of bravery and ingenuity inspire you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Backstory and stakes. The idea had begun 2 years earlier, in 1941, inside a quiet office hidden behind the brick facade of 20 Earl Street, London, the headquarters of a secret branch of British intelligence known only to a few. Formed under the direction of Air Commodore Christopher Clayton Hutton and Major Norman Crockett, its mission was as improbable as it was vital: to help captured Allied soldiers and airmen escape from behind enemy lines, using deception, creativity, and whatever objects could pass for toys or household goods. Among MI9's many innovations, one stood out for its genius simplicity. The War Office had received mounting reports from Germany. Hundreds of RAF airmen were being held in remote camps. Stalag Luft III, Colditz Castle, Stalag 70, each surrounded by barbed wire guard towers and miles of forest. Conventional rescue was impossible. If escape was to succeed, it would have to begin inside the prisoners' hands. Hutton, a former journalist with the Daily Express and part-time magician, was convinced that no lock, no fence, no man could outthink imagination. His task was to get the tools of escape: maps, compasses, files, past German inspection. His solution: hide them inside something every guard recognized and ignored. A game. The connection came through Waddington's Limited, the British company licensed to print Monopoly boards. Using silk from neutral Switzerland, which didn't crinkle when unfolded, they printed detailed escape maps showing rail lines, safe houses, and neutral borders. Tiny brass compasses were disguised as ordinary tokens. Even razor blades for cutting through wire were pressed into the cardboard between the chance and community chest cards. To the untrained eye, nothing looked suspicious. To a captured pilot, it was salvation wrapped in paper money. By 1943, hundreds of such games had been distributed through the Red Cross parcel system, marked with small dots on the free parking or waterworks squares, codes only Allied prisoners understood. The stakes were enormous. Each successful delivery meant another chance at freedom, not just for one man but for entire crews lost over Europe. Failure meant exposure of the entire MI9 network, and execution for anyone caught participating. For Flight Lieutenant John Ashford of the No. 83 Squadron, shot down over France in 1942 and imprisoned at Stalag Luft III. That small square of silk meant everything. He'd been captured during a bombing run over Kassel, surviving both flak and interrogation. Now his sense of duty burned into a single promise: if I can walk free again, I'll bring the others with me. He wasn't alone. Across hundreds of POW camps, coded messages began to circulate. New games arrived: keep the boards safe. Each man who held one understood the risk. A folded map was more than cloth, it was hope. And for MI9's secret network, it wasn't just about escape, it was proof that intelligence could be mightier than barbed wire. The impossible situation. Winter at Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Germany. 1943. The snow came early that year, blanketing the pine forest in white silence. From the air, the camp looked orderly. Rows of wooden huts, guard towers at each corner, and double fences stretching across the frozen earth. But from the ground it felt endless, a cage built with precision and paranoia. For the prisoners inside, every sound carried meaning. The crunch of boots on gravel signaled a guard patrol. The metallic squeak of the gate meant another work detail was leaving, or someone was being taken to interrogation. Beneath the stillness, hundreds of men planned, whispered, and dreamed, yet freedom always seemed to exist just an inch beyond reach. The geography itself mocked escape. The camp sat in the middle of a flat plain, surrounded by thick pine forest, beautiful, but deadly. Any man who ran faced open snowfields with no cover, dogs trained to follow scent for miles, and German towns too afraid or too loyal to offer shelter. The fences were layered, one inner wire, one outer wire, and a warning track of raked sand in between. Guards watched for footprints that crossed the line. Even the air was against them. The cold cut through boots and blankets, and food rations barely kept a man upright. Rations came twice daily, watery soup, black bread, sometimes a scrap of meat, no bigger than a coin. Red Cross parcels provided relief, but never enough. Hunger hollowed the faces of men who once flew bombers and commanded squadrons. Cigarettes became currency, chocolate, a memory of home. Every day followed the same rhythm. Roll call, labor, boredom, roll call again. To the Germans it was discipline, to the prisoners it was psychological warfare, the slow erosion of hope. Yet for all their surveillance, the guards never understood one truth. The prisoners' minds were their most dangerous weapons, but those minds had limits too. Hundreds of escape attempts had failed, tunnels collapsed, guards found uniforms, dogs caught scent trails. After each failure, punishments grew harsher, inspections more thorough. The commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner, prided himself on running an escape-proof camp. Still, among the prisoners hope flickered, fragile but alive. They knew of a rumor spreading quietly between huts, that somewhere in England, men were sending help through impossible means. No one believed it, not yet. But when a Red Cross parcel arrived marked games and recreation, curiosity turned to suspicion. Inside, an ordinary Monopoly board waited, its corners creased, its colors dull. No one yet knew that freedom was printed between its lines. The spark, the plan, it began as a whisper between bunk beds, then as a rumor across huts. The games are not what they seem. Flight Lieutenant John Ashford, once a navigator with number 83 Squadron, first noticed something strange while unwrapping a parcel in hut. The Monopoly board inside was different. The printing felt thicker, heavier. The paper squares weren't perfectly aligned, but what caught his attention was the faint red dot in the corner of the free parking space. A marking so small it could have been a printing error. That night, when the lights went out and the guard's footsteps faded, Ashford pried at the board's edge with a dull razor blade. A thin line of glue cracked. Beneath the cardboard he felt silk. He unfolded it carefully, and a map shimmered in the candlelight. Rivers, rail lines, border town, Switzerland, Spain, Sweden, all neutral, all possibilities. It wasn't just a game, it was a message. Word spread quickly through the escape committees. Coded networks formed inside every hut, operating like underground army. Men who had studied cartography, engineering, or linguistics before the war began analyzing every detail. The compasses hidden in tokens actually worked. The metal files shaped like playing pieces could cut through light fence. Even the play money carried coded numbers, each corresponding to escape routes pre-approved by MI9. The revelation electrified the camp. For the first time in months, morale surged. This wasn't blind digging or reckless running. It was coordination, intelligence, precision. And it came from home, from people who hadn't forgotten them. The plan was simple, yet daring. The escape committee would smuggle the boards between huts, extract the maps, and distribute them selectively to airmen whose routes matched the map region. Ashford's group would target the southern corridor through the Bavarian Alps into Switzerland. Others would aim for Denmark or France. Every man memorized as much as he could, then destroyed the evidence. If caught, They'd claim the board was just a game. The Germans never suspected a thing. Games and books arrived routinely through the Red Cross, and even guards sometimes borrowed them to pass time. No one imagined that British intelligence had turned innocent leisure into a weapon. In that moment, the balance shifted. For the first time, the prisoners weren't just surviving, they were fighting back, using wit instead of bullets. And somewhere in London, behind the locked doors of MI9, Clayton Hutton smiled. The enemy had built walls of wire and concrete, but the Allies had built something far stronger: imagination. Quick pause. If you're still watching, take a second to subscribe for more true stories of courage and survival. Preparation and tension build up. By January 1944, the prisoners' huts had become laboratories of ingenuity. Beneath bunks, behind false walls, even inside hollow table legs, fragments of MI9's toys were being assembled into real instruments of survival. Flight Lieutenant John Ashford and his small group met each night after roll call, long after the floodlights swept past their windows. They spoke in whispers, their breath visible in the cold air. Each man had a task. One rewound the thin wire from a heating coil to reinforce the compass casing. Another tested the silk map for waterproofing by soaking a corner in tea. Every discovery came at the price of exhaustion. Sleep was a luxury, silence, a shield. The guards, or Feldwebel, grew suspicious. Surprise inspections increased. At any hour the door could slam open, boots thudding across the floor, bayonets tapping walls for hollow echoes. The men learned to hide everything within seconds. Silk under straw mattresses, compasses under floorboards, razor files tucked inside bars of soap. One mistake, one misplaced token could unravel months of planning. The camp's escape committee, nicknamed the X Organization, coordinated the effort with military precision. They created fake logs to track which huts received games, coded messages about parcels using phrases like "extra milk for tea" to mean tools received safely. They even built a diversion. Several men dug a decoy tunnel nicknamed Fool's Gold, so that if the Germans discovered it, the real operation could continue unnoticed. Outside, the winter deepened, food rations shrank, tempers frayed. The Red Cross parcels became lifelines, and occasionally, Trojan horses. When one parcel was accidentally torn during inspection, revealing the edge of a board game, Ashford's heart stopped. The guard laughed, tossed it back, and said something in German about British children and their silly toys. The men exhaled only when the door slammed shut. Inside the huts, the psychological strain built quiet. Each man knew that if one of them was caught, all could face the cooler, solitary confinement, or worse. Yet the thought of doing nothing was heavier than the risk itself. At night, Ashford often stared at the silk map under his blanket, tracing the black lines that led south toward freedom. A few inches of cloth, and maybe 1,000 miles between life and death. As March approached, the camp buzzed with invisible energy. Tunnels were being readied, guards' patrol schedules memorized. The latest parcel from MI9 had arrived with 2 boards marked differently: red dot for Switzerland, blue for France. It was the signal they had been waiting for. One night, during a blackout caused by a nearby air raid, Ashford whispered the words that would set everything in motion. Tomorrow night, you 300 hours, we roll the dice. 6th Berkeley escape attempt. March 3, 1944. Stalag Luft III. The camp was silent. Too silent. Snow muffled every sound. The floodlights along the perimeter flickered weakly, the generators straining against the cold. Inside Hut 104, 12 men waited in darkness, layered in stolen German coats and scraps of civilian clothing sewn from old uniforms. Ashford crouched near the stove, checking the tiny compass one last time. Its needle trembled, catching the faint glow of the embers. North, he whispered, then east by the tracks. At precisely 02:47, the patrol passed the watchtower near the southern fence. 2 guards, 2 dogs. The moment they turned, Ashford lifted the floorboard. Beneath it, a narrow tunnel stretched out, just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The air smelled of earth and rusted tin. One by one, they descended, each carrying a fragment of the MI9 kit: a file, a folded silk map, a compass, and a prayer. The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic. The men moved slowly, dragging themselves forward by their elbows, counting inches instead of feet. The wooden braces groaned. Someone whispered a curse when his boot scraped rock. Above them, the rhythmic crunch of boots crossed the snow. The patrol returning, they froze. Silent. Then the faint bark of a dog. Ashford held his breath until his lungs burned. The dog sniffed once at the air vent, then moved on. When the footsteps faded, he exhaled, trembling. "Keep moving," he mouthed. The first man emerged beneath a pile of snow near the outer fence. The air felt sharper than freedom itself. They cut through the wire with the hidden blades, slow, steady, one twist at a time. Every metallic click echoed like thunder in their minds. The wire gave way, curling silently into the frost. But fate tested them again. A flare burst overhead, turning night into blinding white. Every man dropped flat, hearts pounding. The flare hissed out after what felt like eternity. The guards shouted somewhere near the north compound, chasing ghosts. The group crawled forward through the frozen field, their breath clouding in the moonlight. By dawn they reached the tree line, exhausted, soaked, but alive. The map unfolded under the faint morning light, the silk glistening, red rivers, black railways, names of towns that sounded like hope. They split into pairs, each team following different routes. Ashford and his comrade Sergeant Peter Lane followed the tracks toward Görlitz, blending with workers walking to nearby factories. Their stolen coats fooled the first checkpoint. The guard barely looked up. At night they hid in barns, navigating by starlight and the trembling needle of their tiny compass. Hunger gnawed, but adrenaline carried them on. 2 days later, they reached the edge of the Bavarian Alps, the final barrier between captivity and neutral Switzerland. The mountains rose like jagged shadows, cruel and magnificent. Snowstorms rolled in, erasing trails and blinding vision. The silk map nearly froze in Ashford's hands, but the markings still shone through. They pressed forward, mile by mile. Behind them alarms sounded. Stalag Luft III had discovered the tunnel. The Germans fanned out search parties, dogs, trucks, aircraft, all chasing ghosts in the snow. But the forests swallowed their track. On the fourth night, beneath a sky pierced with stars, Ashford saw it. The faint glimmer of lights across the valley. Swiss lights. He dropped to his knees, too weak to speak. Lane laughed through chattering teeth. They crossed a small river at dawn, and with that final step, the war for them was over. In the still morning air, Ashford looked back toward the border. Somewhere beyond those mountains, men were still waiting in their huts, unaware that the game boards in their hands carried freedom. He whispered softly, "Thank you, MI9. Then they disappeared into the snow. 3 days after Ashford's team slipped out, the alarm bell at Stalag Luft III hadn't stopped ringing. Guards flooded every hut. Dogs barked through the night. Floodlights swept over snowdrifts, searching for footprints that had already vanished in the wind. Inside Hut 1112, Flight Sergeant Tom Bennett and Corporal David Clark, the second team, waited for a signal that never came. Their tunnel exit had collapsed halfway through. The wooden bracing, soaked by thawing snow, gave way with a dull crack. Clark barely escaped before the ceiling sealed behind him. The sound echoed through the barracks above, drawing a guard's attention. For an hour they lay buried under floorboards as boots stomped overhead. Bennett's lungs filled with dust. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the patrol outside. The guard lifted the hatch, glanced in, and by chance or mercy, moved on. When they finally crawled out, half their tools were gone. Buried in the tunnel, the compass was broken, the silk map torn. They had only one option: go north instead of south, and hope to find resistant safehouses rumored near Dresden. By the second night, exhaustion blurred the edges of thought. The cold became an enemy of its own, sharp, patient, invisible. Clark's fingers were numb, his boots soaked through. When they reached a railway bridge, a passing train offered cover, but as they climbed down the embankment, a lantern beam cut through the dark. Halt! They froze. The beam steadied, then flicked upward, blinding them. A guard approached. Rifle raised. Bennett's mind raced. Run and die. Or bluff and there maybe live. He forced a smile, muttered in broken German that they were laborers returning from repairs. The guard frowned. Another beam joined his, lighting the forged civilian coats. The silence stretched thin. Then a shout. Gefangene prisoners. Shots cracked through the air. Clark stumbled, clutching his side. Bennett grabbed him by the arm, dragging him into the tree line. Branches tore at their faces, boots slipping in mud. Behind them dogs barked. Men shouted. Flares hissed. They reached a ditch and fell silent. Clark was bleeding, his breath ragged. Go, he whispered. Don't waste it. Bennett shook his head. He knew the rule. Never leave a man. But the forest was closing in, and the sound of pursuit grew louder. He pressed Clark's compass, cracked but still trembling north, into his hand. Then we both go, he said quietly. 1 more mile. The shots faded. Somehow, impossibly, they slipped away, but not unscarred. For the men who made it, and for those who didn't, the Monopoly boards were no longer games. They were lifelines. And for MI9, one captured escapee could expose the entire network. Every mile forward was borrowed time. Quick reminder, enjoying the story? Subscribe now to uncover more untold moments of courage and escape. Yet for the few who had escaped Stalag Luft III, survival remained a day-to-day battle. Hunger, exhaustion, and the constant shadow of recapture. Flight Lieutenant John Ashford and Sergeant Peter Lane trudged through pine forests, their boots falling apart, their last biscuit shared 3 days earlier. At night they followed the stars, by day the compass. Every sound in the distance, a truck, a barking dog, a shout, sent adrenaline burning through their veins. On the 12th night, they reached a small hamlet, near the Austrian border. The houses were dark, windows shut. Lane collapsed behind a stone wall, whispering that he could go no further. Ashford forced him up. 1 more mile, he said, echoing Bennett's words, unaware they had become prophecy. Then came a flicker of light ahead, a farmhouse lantern swinging slowly in the wind. They approached cautiously, ready to flee at the slightest sound. But the man who opened the door was not a soldier. He was a farmer, old, weary, eyes full of something between pity and courage. He said only one word, Schweiz, Switzerland. Ashford nodded. The farmer motioned them inside, closed the door and pointed toward the back fields. Knocked. Go. He pressed a loaf of bread into Lane's hands, then disappeared into the dark without asking name. That night, guided by the map and the compass that had survived every inspection, they reached the river that marked the border. The water was half frozen, black as oil. Lane hesitated. If we cross, and it's the wrong side, Ashford smiled faintly. Then at least we try. They waded in. The cold bit like fire. Each step forward felt endless. Halfway through, the current pulled hard. Lane slipped, vanished for a second beneath the surface. Ashford lunged, grabbed his coat, dragged him up, coughing, gasping, alive. They stumbled onto the far bank, collapsing into reeds. A light flickered nearby, not German but Swiss patrol lamps. Voices spoke softly in French. Anglais, one asked. Ashford nodded weakly. The soldier lowered his weapon. Bienvenue, you're safe now. The words barely registered before exhaustion claimed them both. When Ashford awoke, it was daylight. He was in a hospital bed, wrapped in clean sheets, the scent of coffee filling the air. A British officer stood at the foot of his bed, an MI9 liaison. You've done more than escape, the officer said. You've proven the system works. Over the next months, dozens more POWs would follow similar routes, guided by those same Monopoly maps and tools smuggled through MI9's secret network. The Germans never discovered the operation before the war ended. Even after liberation, the details remained classified for years. As for Ashford and Lane, both were debriefed, fed, and eventually returned to England. When asked what had kept him alive, Ashford simply said, a child's game, and the mines that turned it into hope. He visited Waddington's Limited once after the war. The factory was back to printing real board games again. No secret maps, no silk layers. Yet he remembered holding that first board, knowing it contained a world beyond its squares. He traced his finger along the old route one last time, from go to free parking, and smiled. Freedom, he realized, had never been about luck. It had been engineered. Aftermath and historical context. When Germany surrendered in 1945, the full story of MI9's secret operations finally began to surface. Quietly, carefully, and only within official military archives. For years the details had remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. Even many of the men who owed their freedom to those mysterious Red Cross parcels never learned how deeply the plan had been woven into British intelligence. Inside the records of the Air Ministry and War Office, investigators discovered something extraordinary, an entire branch of wartime logistics devoted not to weapons or machinery, but to deception, design, and survival. Between 1941 and 1945, MI9 had produced thousands of modified civilian items, shaving brushes that concealed compasses, playing cards that peeled back to reveal maps, and most famously, Monopoly boards with silk escape charts and hidden tools pressed inside their cardboard frames. Each board was tailored to a region of captivity: northern Germany, southern France, Poland, or Italy, printed with coded markings that only Allied officers were briefed to recognize. The silk maps were waterproof, silent when unfolded, and light enough to conceal inside a boot or stitched seam. Small metal compasses and saw blades were slipped between the layers of cardboard, invisible to a casual inspection. The game pieces themselves were cast from brass so they could double as cutting tools. Red Cross parcels provided the perfect cover. Labeled innocently as games and recreation supplies, these packages moved through German channels unchecked, protected by wartime humanitarian agreements. Once inside the camps, selected prisoners quietly distributed the boards to those most likely to attempt escape: navigators, linguists, engineers. The process was disciplined, almost scientific, built on the unspoken trust that discovery would mean execution. By the end of the war, hundreds of escape attempts had been aided by MI9 devices. Some succeeded, others ended in recapture or death. But each attempt carried forward the same belief that imagination could strike deeper than any weapon. In camps built to crush morale, the knowledge that such ingenuity existed gave men a reason to endure one more day. After the war, MI9 was quietly dissolved, its records absorbed into the newly reorganized intelligence services. The surviving members rarely spoke publicly of their work. Major Norman Crockett and Christopher Clayton Hutton retired without ceremony, their contributions buried under years of secrecy. Yet among the veterans who had once risked everything with a silk map hidden inside a game box, the memory never faded. For them, those boards were not symbols of luck. They were proof that somewhere, beyond the wire and the watchtowers, people still believed they were worth saving. In a war defined by destruction, MI9's operation stood as one of its quietest victories. An act of intelligence, faith, and defiance stitched together with cardboard, brass, and silk. Philosophical closing line. In the end, it wasn't a weapon or an army that outwitted the enemy. It was imagination. A children's board game became a map to freedom, carried across continents under the noses of those who believed control was absolute. Within the thin layers of cardboard and silk lay the quiet truth of war, that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it folds neatly into a parcel marked games and recreation. Those who played it weren't chasing luck. They were rewriting the rules. And long after the last battle ended, their story reminds us that freedom is never won by force alone. It's crafted by faith, by intellect, by those who dare to dream while the world is burning. If stories of human courage and ingenuity move you, take a moment to stay connected, so more forgotten heroes can be remembered again. Thanks for watching till the end. Stay tuned and subscribe for more powerful true stories of courage, survival, and the will to be free.